Good evening. I'm Mark Crewman. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Citizenship here at Wayne State University. I also chair the Department of History, and I teach in the History Department. It's an honor and pleasure to welcome you, welcome many of you to the university for the first time. Others welcome you back. The Center for the Study of Citizenship embraces a particular ideal, a vision for the world founded on the notion that vital communities require knowledgeable, active citizens. And I'm pleased to be able to say that the Center for the Study of Citizenship is the leading organization of its kind, not only in the United States, but globally. I've been told I can't talk for a half an hour about the center, and so I will restrain myself. But anyone who would like my card and would like for me to talk with them for a half an hour about the center, just give me a call. But I do want to point something out in particular for tonight, because at a time when our national conversation often seems reduced to sound bites and shouting, the Center for the Study of Citizenship provides a location for conversation across party lines, for conversation across ideological lines. This is a place to engage in a conversation that leads, we hope, to serious action. The center leads the American Democracy Project's National E-Citizenship Initiative. The American Democracy Project is a collaboration of the New York Times and the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. We host the leading global academic conference. We already have received proposals from academics hailing from China, Nigeria, and Germany, and this is for next March. Next week, in the Community Arts Auditorium, we are going to be hosting a debate about same-sex marriage, including the founder of the National Organization for Marriage and a leading advocate for same-sex marriage. At the core of their debate lies one important word, and that is civility. A couple of years ago, the chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Jim Leach, former Congressman, was here to talk about one of the issues that has been a passion of his, and that is civility. And if there is a place where civil discourse must triumph, it is at the university. And we at Wayne, we sit at an international crossroads, hopefully a transportation crossroads as well pretty soon, are an appropriate place to have not just a local and national conversation, but a global conversation. I welcome you here, and I'm thrilled to introduce to you our moderator for the Center's annual Citizenship and Constitution Day program. And that reminds me, please, excuse me, I had asked Harold if he would remind me to tell everyone to turn off their cell phones. And I want to thank you, Harold, for that. The center sponsors a program on citizenship for Citizenship and Constitution Day. We do this on behalf of the university, and it actually is a federal law to have a program, and it's not just for Wayne State, but every institution of education that receives even the least bit of money from the federal government. It's, we've turned a mandate into an exciting program. And our moderator for tonight's program is the distinguished columnist for the Detroit Free Press, Brian Dickerson, who will lead our group, an exciting group it is, and he will handle all of the introductions to a discussion of the impact of the Citizens United U.S. Supreme Court decision on American politics. 2 years ago, the center convened a discussion of the constitutional arguments that underlay the decision. Now we're trying to explore the ways in which Citizens United and related cases have played out on the political ground. We can't have a more thoughtful leader of this discussion of Brian Dickerson, though many of you who are a bit older in the audience may now think of him as a national advocate for the shingles vaccination. If you read his poignant column on his experience this summer. My pleasure to introduce to you Brian Dickerson.
Thank you very much, Mark. And if you're over 50, get your shot. That's all I'll say. In January 2010, ruling in a landmark case known as Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, the United States Supreme Court held that the First Amendment prohibits the government from restricting independent political expenditures by corporations and unions. Citizens United is widely regarded as a watershed moment in the history of campaign finance, and many people have assumed that it's directly responsible for the record campaign spending we've seen both in the 2010 congressional cycle and in the current presidential campaign. But Citizens United was only the latest in a long line of setbacks for people hoping to preserve the campaign finance reforms that were enacted in the wake of the Watergate scandal in the mid-70s. Especially notable since then were a 1976 Supreme Court ruling that equated political spending with speech, and a series of regulatory decisions that have opened the door to virtually unlimited soft money spending. That is, spending by individuals and groups that are interested in promoting political agendas and political candidates, but who have no direct ties, or at least no traceable ones, to a specific candidate. In more and more political races, these so-called independent groups are outspending the candidates themselves by a wide margin. And they've grown very clever at concealing their identities and their political agendas by filtering their contributions through tax-exempt charitable organizations known as 501c4s, which are also exempt from the disclosure requirements that apply to candidates, to political parties, and political action committees. The upshot of all this is a biblical flood of unlimited, unregulated, and untraceable political money. And although it's early to gauge the ultimate impact on the presidential campaign, on the balance of power in Congress, or on the independence of the judiciary, the immediate effect is already manifest in our living rooms and in our psyches. More and more American voters, quite simply, are convinced that the fix is in, that government by the people is a quaint anachronism, and that voters have been reduced to an almost ceremonial role in the political process. We are living, in short, in a country in which an ever-increasing percentage of the electorate regards popular elections as a spectator sport. here this evening to talk about how we got here, what's good and bad about deregulating campaign spending, and how we might restore confidence in the electoral process without trampling the First Amendment rights of donors, are four people who have seen the campaign finance system up close and personal, and I'd like to introduce them in alphabetical order. Jocelyn Benson, to my far right, is a professor at the Wayne State University Law School who specializes in election law and campaign finance. She had the high honor, but arguably the unfortunate timing, to be the Democratic nominee for Michigan Secretary of State in 2010, when an unusually large GOP turnout swept Republicans to victory in all four statewide executive races. She's founded a new organization, Military Spouses of Michigan, after her husband enlisted in the U.S. Army in January 2011. Now known as Army Specialist Ryan Friedrichs, he was deployed to Afghanistan this past July, and whomever or whatever you pray to, please put in a word for a safe return. Harold Beznos, directly next to Jocelyn, is a lawyer, a licensed real estate broker, and a partner in the Beztak land company and numerous other real estate partnerships that build single-family homes, apartment complexes, shopping centers, and office buildings throughout the United States. In addition to a variety of philanthropic activities that he modestly asked me not to enumerate, he's been involved in financing numerous Republican campaigns, including the current GOP presidential campaign. Cynthia Pasky, to your right, my immediate left, is the founder, president, and CEO of Strategic Staffing Solutions, a Detroit-based global IT and business services company with 23 branches in the United States and Europe. She also holds leadership posts on some of the region's most powerful boards and community groups. She's currently chair of the board of directors for the Detroit Downtown Partnership, and she sits on the executive board of Business Leaders for Michigan, the group formerly known as Detroit Renaissance. In addition to providing innovative help for homeless Detroiters, she's been a prominent donor to and fundraiser for candidates for local and statewide office from both parties. And she's graciously stopped here tonight, incidentally, on the way to the airport where she's going to catch a flight to London. Finally, Joe Schwarz is a longtime ear, nose, and throat doc who in his leisure hours has served as mayor of Battle Creek, president pro tem of the Michigan Senate, and a U.S. congressman. From 2004 to 2006, he represented residents of Michigan's 7th congressional district, which encompasses, at least for a few more months, the state's southern tier, from Battle Creek to just west of Ann Arbor. As chairman of Senator John McCain's Michigan campaign in 2000, he spearheaded McCain's upset primary victory over the eventual Republican nominee, George W. Bush. His first and only congressional ended after a memorable collision with an anti-tax super PAC known as the Club for Growth, which spent or raised more than $1 million on behalf of his opponent. And he has been happily practicing medicine in Battle Creek ever since. My objective tonight is to make room for these four people to share their considerable expertise and mostly stay out of the way. I'm going to begin by directing questions to each member of the panel, but as I've told each of them, once the person to whom the question is directed has had the opportunity to get his or her bid in, I encourage anyone else to jump in on any question. I'll try to bring this part of the discussion to a close and open up to the audience no later than an hour from now. So if I could start with Harold and Cindy. This is the geography is going to be a little bit awkward here because you're on opposite sides of me. But you've both exercised very energetically your right to influence the political process. Now you have many more avenues to do so and many more ways to protect your anonymity. And from where I sit, I have to say it looks like an awful lot of fun. So my first question is, how is the new world of campaign finance working out for you as donors and fundraisers? And how do you think it's working out for the rest of us? Harold, why don't you start?
Well, first of all, I think it's a bit too early to express an opinion because we don't have the full period of the election going on. Can you hear me now? I think it's a bit too early to come to any conclusions. My particular opinion on the matter is that I think freedom of speech is very important. And the more media you have, the more sources that you have, my general feeling about the public, they're very smart, they're very intelligent. A lot of politicians don't really feel that way. They think that the public doesn't understand. I think they do understand. I think the more information a public has, the better the candidate is, the better the people are informed, and the better possibility of getting the best and knowing the issues. If you control a PAC, then the politician controls what they want to say. Unfortunately, in today's world, we have a lot of journalists, in my opinion, that are not as smart and wise as they used to be. Some of their opinions are not exactly objective, and they don't necessarily report what are the real issues or what really are the facts. We don't need politicians to come up and give their opinion, reporters to come up and give their opinion of what a politician says. Now, the PACs, they have another voice besides what the newspaper says, what the news commentator says, and so forth. I'm in favor of it. I'm in favor of all the PACs available. I think that the public generally can figure out, even these anonymous PACs, who they are and whom they support. That's my opinion. So far, I have no objection to it. I think it creates an even balance because at one time you had corporations that couldn't donate money, couldn't create PACs in a way that they could now, and you had the labor people could express their opinions even without the support of the members themselves. So we have an issue there. The one thing about a corporation that does that is the fact that they do have to report to the stockholders. So if they do something that's really bad, they have a price to pay. In addition, each company generally has a customer. So if they do something abrasive, something that's not patriotic, they won't be able to sell their product. So I think that today we have a better opinion, or will have a better opinion, on who to vote for and what to vote for.
Cindy, what do you think? Is it a boon for all of us? Is it a boon for you? Or do people just want more money from you now that there's no limit on what they can ask for?
People always want more money. I don't think it's a good thing at all. I think that when you engage in the political process, you should do your research, whether you're a corporation, whether you're labor, whether you're an individual. You should understand the candidates. And if you're going to support a candidate, if you're going to support a valid issue, if you're going to support for or against, then you should be able to and be willing to put your name behind it. And if you're not willing to do that, then you shouldn't participate. And so to be able to raise dollars, and I don't care if it's a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, I don't care if it's labor, if it's business, if you don't have the gumption to put your name behind what you believe in, then you shouldn't be able to put dollars behind it. And I think what this does is it started a trend in the United States that's appalling. Look at the blog on the Free Press. You shouldn't have to monitor the postings on the blog for the idiots that when someone is shot, zing out there because they can hide their name and say, oh, he deserved it, right? I mean, think of all of the things that happen with the fact that we have free speech in the United States because we can hide our name now. That's completely unacceptable. That's not the United States. And when you take that to the political process and you put dollars behind it, you feed into what I think is wrong. So I think if you're going to raise money and you're going to contribute and you're going to support or you're going to work against or work for whatever side you're on, and I'm glad you said, I engage in the political process. I don't engage as a Republican or a Democrat. I engage in a candidate I believe in because I've researched them. They could be a Republican, they could be an independent. I can support a process. It's never just one party. Sometimes it's no party. But if I'm going to put my dollars behind it, I know I'm going to have my name on a list. I know it's going to be published, and I'm okay with that. And if it's going to be listed, it's okay because I've done my research and I'll stand behind it. And if you don't have the gumption to do it, then don't engage. And to create an environment where that can happen, we have blogs, we have letters, we're creating a trend where people can be rude and disrespectful and create fear. And I think this adds to that. That does not work for the United States. So now, you think about it, here we are, we have an organization, the Center for the Study of Citizenship, and we say we want knowledgeable and active citizens. And what you're doing is you're creating an environment where you're going to have 3 other words: knowledgeable and active citizens that are either secure, brave, or fearless. Or it won't matter if they're knowledgeable and active, because they won't be comfortable enough to do anything with it. So I don't think it works.
Harold, before I move on to Jocelyn and Joe, is there any room between you and Cynthia on this issue? Do you think there is any civic purpose that is served by allowing donors to contribute anonymously?
I don't think. I think there's some people that want to do it anonymously. I think that if they choose to do it, it's their right and their freedom to donate to a PAC or to the individual in either case. Now, there may be a reason that a person may do it. There may be a reason that a person may do it anonymously because they're in a certain business. They're afraid they may support somebody else that is contrary to where they work, for example. Let's say they have a high position at some company and they want to report and support a Democrat or Republican, and the boss doesn't want them to, and they don't want their name mentioned. Why shouldn't they donate? Here's the trick, or here's the thing. It's not really a trick. Once you donate to a PAC, you can't control what that PAC is doing anyway. So you have to choose. You have to be smart about it. But it's a way of expressing your opinion. It's a way of doing something. I think it's appropriate. And in our country, the truth always comes out, one way or another. And I think it's very helpful.
Thank you. My next question is for Jocelyn and Joe. You've both run campaigns in the era of soft money run amok. And I wonder, from the candidate's perspective, what's the difference between facing a campaign and a candidate who's visible and fighting an opponent you can't see? Jocelyn?
Thank you. I think 2 things, and just to give you the data on my race, there was actually, in 2010, I raised about 80 to 90% of the funds that were spent to further my candidacy were raised through my campaign committee and fully disclosed. On my opponent's side, $150,000 was raised through a campaign committee. $1.5 million was spent from my opponent's political party, undisclosed, and it's still to this day. So with that backdrop, I would say there's 2 things. There are 2 impacts through that sort of imbalance in my experience that would answer or respond to your question. One, there's a question of we don't know. When we don't know where the money's coming from, we don't know who a political candidate or leader is actually working for or who they're being influenced by. And that becomes very difficult, not from the idea that we can't defend against an opponent we can't see, but more that we don't know. A lot of times, candidates say one thing and do another. And in terms of judging a candidate's actions or potential actions once elected, it's hard to do that if you don't have information about who's influencing them behind the scenes. So that was, I think, one frustration in terms of being a candidate running against someone who had, for whom the 80 to 90% of the funds were undisclosed. The second piece is that that undisclosed money, I believe, can alter or even corrupt the political discourse in a particular campaign. As an educator who likes to talk and debate and really figure out solutions that are a middle ground that people can agree on, as opposed to saying my way or the highway, it's harder to have that type of discourse that we might have in a setting like this, in a political arena, in part because the discourse is sometimes influenced by in other words, candidate talking points, and their commercials are oftentimes influenced by those who give and invest in their campaign. In order to actually fully evaluate a candidate, not just who they're working for, but also the influence of the discourse and what they're saying, we need to know where the money's coming from. And I think that, to me, was the most frustrating aspect, because it's difficult, again, to have that actual dialogue, that political conversation in a campaign if so much of the influence and the interest is taking place behind closed doors.
Can I make a comment on this matter? And you have certain trade groups that essentially has a pocket of money, and the members have no control where it goes. So you need some competitive other sources of money in order to equalize the publications of those trade groups and where they may, who they may support or what proposition they may support. And I think this law frees up that ability so that now you have an equal situation. I think that the law should say that whatever governs from any group should be the same, so that you have the trade groups, they should get the support of their members and get their members' permission on who to support, as well as you have the other group that doesn't have the donors notified and say anything. If you require that, you should require the same of both. It should be all equal. It shouldn't be unbalanced as it was before this case.
Thank you. Dr. Schwarz, you were in Congress, as I recall, for about 15 minutes before you had to start defending your seat against political opponents in your own party.
The Luddites, yes.
Take us back through that about.
Yeah, I'll be happy to. First, running for office at that level, at the legislative level, almost any level anymore, is mud wrestling anymore, or it's WWF. But it's not a lot of fun. As a result, it's very difficult to recruit good candidates to run for any office anymore. People look at you like you truly are insane if you ask someone to run for the legislature or, God forbid, to run for Congress. As a result, the candidate pool is not what it used to be. Jocelyn, you are a great exception, I might add to that.
Thank you, Congressman.
But the candidate pool is because people don't want to run. They know what's going to happen. They're going to be attacked. They're not going to know where the attack comes from or who pays for it. Their families will be attacked, and it is a very, very unpleasant situation. Information is spewed in the media that is not vetted in any way, shape, or form, so there's no source. You have no clue what's accurate and what isn't. The great example of that going on is the Maroons supporting keeping the Ambassador Bridge as the sole bridge across the Detroit River, which is patent insanity. Having an 83-year-old bridge be the only crossing in the busiest international crossing in the world. But the money keeps coming and coming and coming and coming and coming. They got the issue on the ballot now, and I might add, you heard it here first, the Maroon family has maxed out to two candidates, the two nonpartisan Republican candidates for the Supreme Court, because it's probably that issue is going to end up in the Supreme Court. Now, not many people are going to know that, but in fact, that's what happened. It's $13,800 to each of the two candidates from the rooms. It's on the record. So this is not a nice game. The other thing about it is that most of the money that comes in at the congressional level, some at the state level, but at the congressional level, is out-of-state money. And you have utterly no way to know where that money came from. And the people that come in and spend the money are hired guns, virtually none of them from the state of Michigan, if you're in Michigan where it's all happening. And when the election's over, win or lose, they're out of Dodge and going someplace else to run a campaign in the next cycle. So you're in many ways as voters in the dark, not this perceptive intelligent group here tonight. However, most voters are. Back in the 19th century, William Dean Howells, who was an editor and a great friend of Mark Twain's, said the electorate were the great unwashed, the drinkers of beer, and the breakers of things. That is not totally untrue today, and people will believe what they're going to believe, and unfortunately, they believe a lot of things that are simply not true, and it makes it very difficult to run. Many members of Congress spend virtually all their time, I am not making this up, I have seen it, many members of Congress spend virtually all of their time while in Washington raising money. Go from the office building that they're in, the Cannon building, the Longworth building, the Rayburn building, over to the DCCC or the Republican Congressional Committee, and cold call every night that they're in Washington, or they're at a fundraiser. It's out of control, and Citizens United made it only more out of control, and hopefully after this election cycle, people will wake up and see this is insanity, and we have to do something about it.
Harold, let me bring this back to you for a moment. A lot of people unhappy with the campaign finance landscape right now say the real problem is not Citizens United, but a much older case called Buckley v. Vallejo, in which the Supreme Court ruled in, and I'm being a little bit simplistic here, but essentially they said that political expenditures were a form of speech, and that any attempt to regulate those expenditures had to be tailored so as not to infringe upon the First Amendment rights of people like Harold Beznos.
Well,
but my question is, well, let me go on to say that people unhappy with that decision counter that speech is speech, and money is more like an amplification system that gives people with money the ability to speak louder than everybody else. Why isn't allowing people with money the ability to speak louder and longer than others an affront to the whole idea of democracy?
democracy is a very cherished right. We are a very fine, we're the greatest country in the world, and we're the best democracy in the world. And one of the reasons why that, we have free speech. Now, I believe in the American public. I've been in business for many, many years, started working when I was 14 or 15. The people understand they don't buy a product that's bad, and that includes a politician. They're wise, they figured it out. And there's no reasons why you should think that we should restrict freedom of speech as long as it's fair and balanced. Now, who makes that judgment? The general public. They'll make the right decision. And they're going to make the right decision in this election. And the pundits that says who's going to win or not going to win, it'll be meaningless. People will express their opinions through these PACs. The candidates will express them. The big option, a big question today is the Internet. Look at the Internet. The Internet today is even more important than the newspapers. We don't know who the sponsors of some of these different groups that are posting these things. Why is that board different than what these PACs do? Now, I think that the truth would prevail. And I know Mr. Schwarz doesn't want to have that bridge built by Manny Maroon. As far as I'm concerned, I'm not particularly impressed with it either. But if the public wants it built, they'll vote for it. Why not? They have the choice. Why should his opinion? Now, just because he's spending a lot of money in it, the public's not a fool. If the governor feels that's a bad thing, let him spend some money and say why it's bad.
But at least Matty Baroon is running ads about the bridge.
Well, we know,
And-
but we know it's Manny Maroon.
Well, we do. And those
So-
are two exceptions to the rule of this new form of campaign finance. Because it's been my experience that if a group of farmers is upset that Congressman Schwarz voted against soybean subsidies, the last thing in the world they're going to do is buy airtime to say why he should have voted for soybean subsidies. They're going to say that he voted to let child molesters out of jail, that he voted to take your guns away, a whole lot. And then there's going to be a tagline that says something like, Citizens for a Better Community.
Former member of the Agriculture Committee, I never met a soybean subsidy I didn't like.
I've seen these
I chose a
bridge
bad
commercials.
example.
I don't know if anyone's seen these bridge commercials that we're talking about, but I actually don't think that, if I didn't know about the background, I would not conclude that the owner of the Ambassador Bridge was paying for them. I also wouldn't even conclude that they're about what they're actually about. They're about being able to pay for firefighters and police officers, right? Is anyone, and so I don't think we should assume, even with the Maroon example, that the commercials are completely truthful and that everyone watching them knows what's actually going on behind the scenes and the intent behind the person paying for the ads.
We have more disclaimers and regulations for a prescription drug commercial than we do for a political commercial. And that's just unacceptable.
Jocelyn, my Free Press colleague, Ron Zwankowski, suggests a simple rule for voters. He says, if they won't tell you who they are, don't let them tell you what to do or who to vote for. I think that's pretty sensible, and I try to follow it. And when I'm looking at some information and I have no idea who is promoting a candidate or a cause or why, I tend to simply disregard the information. And I think a lot of other voters do too. So if Harold or Cindy want to spend lots and lots of money to put up these anonymous ads, why not say, knock yourself out? What is the harm that people who want to regulate that are seeking to stop?
I think the harm is a misinformed electorate. And the absence of any other consistent and equally loud source of information, we run the risk of seeing democracy flounder because we're failing to cultivate an informed and engaged electorate. In my view, what disclosure requirements ultimately do are promote those goals, help further the amount of information that's available to the electorate, and in doing so, empowers the electorate to make more decisions. I actually don't think I don't think it serves the goals of having an informed and engaged electorate to say, well, the speech is out there, they can just ignore it. I actually think we should be promoting speech that informs the electorate, that informs consumers about how companies that they spend their money on, spending their profits on ads, that informs union members about how union leaders are spending money. All of that information can only help us be better stewards of our democracy, and in a situation where in 2010 over half of the eligible voters in the state stayed home, that is a problem that we all must solve. And one of the many steps we must take in further engaging, further promoting civic engagement in our state is providing this information to the public and then trusting them to do with it what they will.
One comment that I'd like to make.
You agree with me?
No, not necessarily. At least not in the first instance. But I've been thinking for a long time about, we look at Michigan, and you look at Michigan, and you look at the legislature, and it's not necessarily Republican and Democrat, it's almost all the same. And you look at the spending, it's almost all the same. They run over the budget. The budget was in a deficit during the Granholm period, but yet you had a lot of Republicans vote for it. But when you look behind the scenes and you look at who their political donations are, there were a lot of union support there to the Republicans, a lot of them. So, in my opinion, when you have all these different PACs come out, and now there's a truth squad that can say, why should a legislator vote for a raise on a public servant employees because a union donates money to that particular situation? Those things should come out too. And so I think that there's certain things about the PACs and about that they all should be equal, they all should follow the same rules, and they all should disclose what they do.
Anybody think that any kind of political donor should be exempt from disclosure requirements?
Any donor should be exempt?
Can you think of
No
any?
donor should be exempt.
I agree with
Okay.
that.
Does
agree.
everybody agree with that?
I agree with that, because then you don't have the conflict. I mean, then you do have, these people are accountable for the legislative body. And when they spend too much money because they get a donation and the public is aware of it, that's very helpful.
I'll raise one counter argument that was made to me and I think is worth putting on the table. There are organizations, and I think you alluded to this earlier, where donor privacy might be critical to enabling that organization to survive. For example, Planned Parenthood, ACLU. There are several organizations like that who are against disclosure or reticent to disclose their donors because they fear that that donors may not give, or some donors, not all, some donors may not make a contribution for fear of some, and it's not just the examples I'm giving. I think you were referring to this earlier as well. And so that to me is the counter argument that's been raised. I just put that out there. I personally, given everything that I've said tonight, obviously that it's not something I agree with, but I think it is something to think about in terms of carefully developing a disclosure regime that acknowledges some of those complications.
Well, and I think we'd agree that we'd want to provide anonymity to donors to the Committee to Defend Salman Rushdie, for instance.
The point that Jocelyn made was just a very good one. And in a world that is utterly chock full of inexactitude, which is what politics is, there are very few absolutes. And the one that you just cited is probably an exception to the absolute. And I don't disagree with that. And just another comment about the legislature, where I spent 16 years, and monies coming into the legislature. We probably won't get into this tonight, but there were always a number of good friends in the lobby corps. One of the things you realize, you get elected to the legislature, you have all these wonderful new good friends that come see you. The number of lobbyists, the number of legislators' friends has increased at least 2.5 to 3-fold since term limits came in. And one of the things we should address tonight, perhaps, or maybe not, I'll address it very briefly, is the fact that the repository of knowledge, the history of what's gone on in Michigan politics and issues now rests with the lobbying community, who have been there far longer than any legislators, or with the executive branch, or the bureaucracy in state government, and I will tell you that the bureaucracy in Michigan state government is very smart, very well trained, and very able. So legislators now, when they come in, all this money floating around, your ego gets a big push when you get first elected to the legislature. There are no mentors in the legislature anymore to take new members and show them the ropes, show them where the men's room is, that sort of thing. So as a result, it's the blind leading the blind. And that gets back to the question of campaign finance and dollars that come in. Basically, a term-limited legislator, at least in his or her first term, and maybe through the 6 years they're allowed in the House, follow the money because they don't know any differently and because there's no one there to tell them any differently. So take a look at that sometimes if you want to take a look at numbers of registered lobbyists in our state capital. The numbers are skyrocketing. They will continue to move up. The money will continue to flow as long as we have term limits. And I can tell you my opinion. Term limits, the single dumbest thing that was ever sold with out-of-state money. We don't know where it came from. Term Limits USA, we're not sure who funds Term Limits USA, but I think the name is spelled K-O-C-H. That's how we have term limits, and you know, it is awful. I chaired the National Conference of State Legislatures study group on term limits. At some point, we need perhaps to have a panel on term limits. 25 states had term limits. 16 now have term limits. All the states that had term limits by statute have repealed. Some states that had it by constitutional amendment have had the term limits repealed by their state Supreme Court. And some of the states that still have term limits have legislatures that hardly meet at all. But in states like California, Michigan, Ohio, which are the three big populous term limit states, it's a bad deal. Montana, what difference does it make? The Montana legislature meets 60 days every 2 years.
Well, and on that note, I think we can't divorce campaign finance reform from lobbying reform. Michigan has some of the weakest lobbying regulations in the country, weakest disclosure laws for lobbyists in the country, and also no requirements that legislators disclose their personal finances. We're one of only 3 states out of 50 that don't have that requirement. So we need to do serious work there as well.
I want to get back to that in just a moment, but before I leave you, Jocelyn, I want to pursue the argument you were making a moment ago. You said there might be an argument for preserving the anonymity of some groups whose political activity might otherwise threaten their survival if it became publicly known. It strikes me that corporations are also interested in their survival. And let me pose to you a conundrum. Suppose that I'm General Motors, and I'm the chairman of General Motors, and I've determined that if the Democratic presidential candidate's energy policy is implemented in Congress, the future of my corporation is seriously imperiled. At the same time, the future of my corporation is also seriously imperiled if I can't sell cars to Democrats as well as Republicans. And if it becomes known that I am a leading bankroller of the Republican presidential candidate, perhaps my Democratic business will dry up. Why isn't that an equally valid argument?
Well, I think it's an argument that we should be sensitive to, but I agree with what Cindy started us out by talking about, which is that if you're going to spend money to influence the political process, to influence legislators, to influence an election, you do have to be prepared to stand by whatever you're saying, to stand by your ad, to stand by your communication. And I do believe that should hold true as well to organizations with sensitive missions. I think the solution is to say you can create separate funds. If you would like to raise money for the explicit purpose of furthering your political agenda, let donors know that they're going to have to be prepared to lose their anonymity. But if they still want to give to you and maintain that anonymity, just use those funds for non-political activity. So that to me is how we get around ground or at least compromise on that issue. But I do agree that we. With all sympathy towards the point you just made with regards to corporations, that the essence of disclosure is to simply say if you're going to play in the political arena, there are some costs to it. And the biggest cost is you lose your anonymity.
Okay.
Well,
Harold, go ahead.
your example is precisely the reason government should not be in business, because they can't be objective. And I'm talking about the business. General Motors should not be owned by the federal government. They should sell the stock. Should I repeat what I said?
Sure, yeah.
I said, by the example that was given, the government should not be in the private sector business because they have no business running General Motors. They don't know what they're doing. The people, the professional people do. And if they can't criticize or bring to the legislature what they want, that company's going to go out of business.
But General Motors had one of the largest lobbying staffs in Washington long before the government took an equity stake in them.
I understand that. I
Yeah.
just made a comment that because the chairman of General Motors is afraid of taking a position as opposed to what the president wants, and he's afraid of the consequences, is the reason why the federal government shouldn't be in the private sector business. They should sell the stock.
Fair enough. Cindy, it looks as though 5 Supreme Court justices are determined to make sure that you can spend whatever you want to influence political elections or political policy in general. But as you've heard, Professor Benson has proposed legislation, maybe even a constitutional amendment, that would require real-time disclosure of any expenditure you make or your company makes for any political purpose, not just to promote a candidate, but to lobby for or against a regulation, to, perhaps even to promote some charitable cause you deeply believe in. Could any reasonable person object to that? And how far do you think disclosure should go? Do you think you should be able to hide behind the name of your business? Do you think your name and the name of your business should be out there every time you write a check?
Well, there'll always be debate about reasonable, right? I think that will be when they're done with their ruling, that will really be, we'll see how well they do. But I don't think you should hide behind anything. I think that how they rule will tell us if we're left with the ability to have true debate, which we should be able to have. When we can write checks to no end, when we can have advertising to no end, when we can have what we have now, the ability to actually have political debate, political discussion, political research, we don't have that in the United States anymore. We don't, every so often we have election cycles where we have crossover votes, crossover candidates, but we have it very rarely. And it hurts the United States, it hurts our political process at all levels. So you should feel good about engaging in the process. The ability to engage in a political process is a gift. There are still countries in the world where you cannot vote. There are still countries in the world where you are told how to vote. There are still countries in the world where you are told what you contribute to, when you contribute to, and you go to jail and prison if you don't. It's a gift to be able to do this. And I know I sound very Pollyannish, but I am so frustrated. I would love to be able to take students and port them to this little tiny country called Belarus and say, you spend a week and try and engage in the political process there, and you come back here and tell me why you won't vote and why you won't understand what our candidates can and can't do here, and why you won't even write a $25 check for a candidate that you believe in. Because there, if you don't vote the way you're told to vote in 2012, you're in jail, and you won't get a job, and your education won't be paid for. So you shouldn't have to feel like you hide behind what you believe in. And the fact that the answer, I think, you know, the answer to the issue with labor, okay, let's talk about what the big elephant in the room is here. Business doesn't like the fact that labor seems to be able to get a lot more money to candidates because of the way they deal with unions and dues than business can. So instead of treating the symptoms, perhaps what we need to do is go back to ground zero and say, let's put everybody on the same playing ground. Let's have unions have to line up and disclose and contribute exactly the same way as business. No exceptions, UAW. No exceptions, Teamsters. No exceptions, ASME. Everybody, same way. Everybody collects the same way. Everybody contributes. Everybody puts their name on the same thing instead of treating the symptoms. Let's not let it have a free-for-all. But you should never hide from the political process. We have a gift in the United States. And what we're doing is we're throwing it away along with millions of dollars, and we're not driving any change, and we're wasting an opportunity. What we do is we spend more money every single election cycle, and we have lower voter turnout.
I agree with you 100%. I think there should be disclosure on everybody's part. And I'm not a politician, but sometimes I get involved with it. I have never myself ever experienced any difficulty because I supported one candidate and not another. And I've supported some Democrats and a number of Republicans. And I don't care if somebody criticizes me or not. It's my opinion, my vote. If I donate money to them, it's my money. Or if I raise money for them, it's somebody else's money and they get credit for it. And nobody should be afraid of using their name. I've never had any problems with respect. And most people know where I lean politically, and I've never had a problem. And I know people that lean in another direction, and so what? We're the same country, same people, same rights, same objectives.
May I add on that, and particularly being inspired by Cindy's very passionate remarks, and I think, and you're agreeing with them, and of course Congressman Schwarz' dedication to this issue. I'd like to see something on the ballot in 2014 to amend our state constitution to require instant disclosure of all money in the political process, union money, corporate money, individual money. And I'd like to ask my fellow panelists to work with me on that, because I want to to work on the language, to work on the development, to work on the passage of it, because I think that it is and must be a bipartisan effort. It is and must be wholly inclusive with lots of input, and I think the four of us, as well as anyone else we invite to the table, and perhaps if Brian would like to come as well, would be an opportunity to work together to actually change this law. And I do believe that the majority of citizens in the state would support this type of effort.
I agree completely, and I just want to bring it down out of the ether onto the ground here a little bit and say that, full disclosure is a good idea. The process would work better with full disclosure. I want to use the example of primary elections because the money people have figured out how to get their candidates elected, and they do it, especially a candidate who is relatively extreme on one side or the other. They dump the money into primary elections in a heavily Republican district or a heavily Democratic district, and the organization that supports perhaps the most extreme positions on a number of issues will dump the most money in. In my case, it was Club for Growth going against me because I, at that point, was a moderate Republican, and the chap that beat me is someplace to the right of Attila the Hun. That's just simply the way it is. Primary elections, what percentage of people vote in primaries? Well, the answer is maybe an average of 16%, 17%. And in a primary election where a fringe group or a group considered radical to the right or the left is in a district where that party will probably win, that group will dump a ton of money in there to get their candidate to win the primary, and a big percentage of that 16% of the electorate who come out and vote will be supporters of that individual. And then when the general election comes along, they just walk away with it because it's a heavily Republican or a heavily Democratic district. The Republicans are more guilty of this than the Democrats. But the whole question of primarying someone and dumping all your resources into a primary is something that people have learned to do in the last 12 to 16 to 20 years. They do it with great success, and that is one of the reasons, if you take a look at the U.S. House of Representatives now, especially on the Republican side, you will find a lot of people who are right out there on the right, and if it's Tea Party, fine. If it's just people, libertarians, the term now Tea-vangelical has come up. That's where they are. 87 freshman members of the Republican conference in the U.S. House come from that sort of a background. So always be aware of what's going on in primary elections. They are very important. Thank you for allowing me to spew on about that.
Well, just to underline what you've said, the most state legislative elections in November are over.
Yeah.
They ended in August.
Yep.
When the parties that have a decisive advantage in one legislative district or another selected their candidates in a poorly attended primary. So I share Congressman Schwarz's frustration because by the time most Free Press readers are paying attention to who's running for the legislature, it's over, and there's nothing really to talk about.
I am utterly amazed that the Democratic Party or other good government people did not take the reapportionment results after the reapportionment as a result of the 2010 census to court. Utterly amazed, because it was the most partisan reapportionment that we have had in my lifetime, which is getting longer by the minute, believe me. So I'm just amazed that they did it. Nobody appealed it, and what we have is what we have, and those districts are precisely as you describe them.
They weren't taken to court because it would have been unsuccessful. The Supreme Court's jurisprudence around political gerrymandering, unfortunately, has developed in such a way that the court has never struck down a redistricting plan because it was overly partisan. It's unfortunate. I disagree with the court's decision, but in terms of the rationale that I'm aware of, that was it, that the likelihood of success, even with the facts before us, was very small. If you remember the Texas gerrymandering plan, back in the 2000s, where I think it was Tom DeLay. And yes, of course.
Ask me what I think about Tom DeLay.
Yeah, that was upheld. That was challenged in the U.S. Supreme Court, and it was upheld despite ample evidence that people actually said we want to draw the districts so that Democrats can't have any representation in Congress. All of the partisan, that was, I think, a high watermark for partisan redistricting nationally, and even that was upheld in the Supreme Court. So that's a whole other discussion to have, but because I agree, it should be challengeable, but it just isn't under our current jurisprudence.
I think 2 of Michigan's reapportioned congressional districts made the top 10 list of the ugliest congressional districts in the country.
The 8 Mile mess.
Because of the way they'd been shaped.
Elbridge Gary jumped out of his grave and did a dance when he looked at that map. Absolutely.
Jocelyn, I want to, first of all, I think I may have been overly simplistic about what you proposed or were getting ready to propose for the ballot this past year. So I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit more about what your disclosure amendment would have specifically required. And secondly, one of the reasons you withdrew it is because you came under a lot of criticism for exempting some labor organizations from the reporting requirements. Do I detect in your comments tonight a tacit promise not to do that again?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the reason I withdrew it was because I agreed with the criticism ultimately that the amount of money that would have been disclosed would have been the bulk of the money in the political process. However, that's not right. It needs to be fully inclusive of every entity, not just labor, not just corporations, but individuals as well. So recognizing that and recognizing that essentially from my standpoint, I will fully admit that patience is not my strongest suit, and so I try to move things quickly, and in doing so, I think missed an opportunity to have a broader input in the language of the proposal, and that's why we decided to wait until 2014 to bring it forward in the hopes that we could get more voices involved, more perspectives involved, and recognize a more inclusive amendment that would cover everyone. So it is my full intention. I will not back anything that does not cover everyone in the future, and because of that, I hope we can actually have a better chance at succeeding, but we will need the support and investment of everyone if we're going to include everyone.
Thank you. Congressman, I don't think I've ever met a voter who said that where a candidate stands on campaign finance reform was the most important thing to that voter. It usually doesn't make the top 15 voter concerns. And yet, I think legislative inaction on this and the continuation of campaign spending going up and becoming easier and easier to hide has made voters very cynical and almost aggressively apathetic, if that's not a contradiction in terms, about the process.
Aggressively apathetic is really a great oxymoron. I like that.
If we get through another congressional cycle with 90% of the electorate saying, make it stop, make them say who they are, do something about this sewage flowing into my living room. If we get through another congressional cycle without any legislative action at the state level, without any congressional action at the federal level, won't it be fair, won't it be time to concede that government by the people is over and government by special interests, at least in the realm of campaign finance, is upon us?
Well, very briefly, I don't think it's ever over, and there will come a time when people have had enough. You name it, I don't know when it's going to be. I think Citizens United will be reversed or partially reversed. I believe the thing that precipitates it will be a scandal of a magnitude that none of us have ever seen before, or multiple scandals. So the denouement is coming. I just can't tell you when, but I believe it's coming.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. History tells us that every time we have meaningful campaign finance reform, it's preceded by a scandal, and it's unfortunate that we have to wait to that to see real change. But if history is any guide, that's what will have to happen.
Okay, I want to ask you all the same question quickly before I open it up to audience questions. I'm appointing you king for the day and giving you the opportunity to make just one change in the campaign finance status quo. What is it? Jocelyn?
Can I make two? It will be a very long-worded change, and it will amend the national constitution to say that money is not speech and can be regulated in the political arena. Larry Tribe, professor at Harvard, has written a great amendment that says that, and so I think that's what's needed on the national level. On the state level, however, the one change I aspire to make and hope to make is a change in our regulations. regulations regarding the definition of political ads. Right now, everything we're talking about is with regards to money to fund political ads. In Michigan, the definition of political ad is actually very narrow. It's an ad that mentions a candidate and says vote for or don't vote for that candidate. So any ad that does not implore the watcher to or the observer to do something as a result of that ad is not considered a political ad. It's considered an issue ad and falls outside the realm of any regulation that we could implement. So really what I'd want to do in Michigan is to change our definition of a political ad to capture any communication, including robocalls, including internet communication, that mentions a candidate within 90 days of an election that they're on the ballot.
Fair enough. Harold, you express probably more satisfaction than most of the panelists here with the status quo. You want to stick with that, or if I give you absolute power, would you tinker a little bit?
Well, first of all, it's a very complex question. You have a right to voice your opinion, free speech, that prevails on everything. I think that the biggest thing we have to do is have the disclosure of donors and sponsors. That will give the particular ad the credibility. So if you know who's behind it, who cares? Let them spend money or let her spend money, and the public will realize whether it's meaningful or not. If they want to spend money, so the TV companies make a lot of money, or the newspapers do. That's fine. That's what I think is important. So you know who it is. And that applies to unions, and applies to corporation and in individuals. And if you don't want your name or anything at risk, don't make the donation.
Thank you. Cindy, Joe, if you know a third option that's better than either of these two, please feel free to suggest it. But there seems to be, you know, just make everybody disclose everything and you can cure most of what's wrong. Or there's Jocelyn's view that the root of all evil is Buckley v. Vallejo, and you really have to upend this notion that speech and money are two forms of the same thing. If you have to pick between those two, between disclosure and overturning Buckley v. Vallejo, which would you go for?
Well, if I had to pick, of course, in my world, I'd find a way not to. I would pick disclosure because then that leads to accountability, and that then leads to people having to be civil. And we need to circle back around to that. And I think if we had disclosure, we could start to deal with issues like out-of-state money in our state, right, that we didn't invite, that people don't realize about, and the whole civility thing, which I touched on earlier. So I think that I agree with the other, but I think that this disclosure lets us address other things that are happening that are really more serious than I think people realize.
Okay. Joe?
Full disclosure, very simple. Full disclosure, where'd the money come from? Somebody's campaign, who donated the money to that campaign? The other thing that I agree with what Jocelyn said is election law, especially in the state, the federal law too, is utter gobbledygook. And we should simply rewrite the laws so most people can understand them. And it is pretty much understandable or not understandable now. It is utter gibberish in statute in Michigan and elsewhere. And election law should be rewritten so you can tell, you know, what a candidate is, what a candidate isn't, what's political speech, what isn't political speech. And this just add on over the years. So now it's basically indecipherable, and it should be decipherable.
Thank you all very much for coping with me. Now I'd like to invite anybody in the audience who'd like to get in on this to go ahead. Yes, sir.
At the end of the day, you have a Congress and a legislature, which is made of people at the extremes. And you can only pass legislation through compromise where the maximum that one side is willing to give up is the minimum that the other side is willing to accept. And right now, if at least at the federal level, if you look at issues like immigration and the budget deficit, in particular the second one, which might in fact be bankrupting our country, there's been absolutely no solution whatsoever because the two sides can't come to an agreement. You have one side saying there must be some revenue, and the other side saying there cannot be any revenue increases. There's no room for a compromise because you have two absolutes, and I believe that's because we have gerrymandered districts which will not produce, it's a distortion of the political system that will not produce people who can compromise. And I would appreciate any responses you have. So my question, I guess, is what is your response?
Panelists?
I would defer to Congressman Schwarz on the gerrymandering question. Through your experience, I would just say as someone, I run a nonprofit that sponsored a redistricting competition this year to make the very points that you made. I do believe that we see a hyper-partisanship as the result of hyperly partisan-drawn districts. I believe the solution that we can implement is to create a Citizens Redistricting Commission that will involve citizens in the redistricting process. That's what we tried to model this year, and we did so, I believe, successfully, producing a map that would have created more competitive districts than any ones that the legislature considered. With regards to your other point, however, on the issue of disclosure of and concerns about that, what I offer is my solution to the question of how can we be sensitive to concerns of anonymity that may be valid with some organizations, is to make the trigger for disclosure the type of speech that you're speaking, and if it is intended to influence an election or an elected official, then you should disclose it, period, regardless of who you are and what you do, because that anonymity is something you must be willing to give up if you're going to engage in political discourse.
Just one comment. Our country is a very unique country. As I said before, we're a country of laws and not of men. If we are worried about anonymity, and we're worried about the governments of the U.S. Federal Tax Bureau or whatever comes after us, there are penalties for that, and those should be enforced. Regarding gerrymandering, it's a complicated problem, as the professor here will tell you, because it's how do you protect minority rights that has an involvement in gerrymandering and other things. It's not an easy answer, but I don't think whether you're left or right or in the middle has anything to do or should have anything to do with anything. It's the expression of that particular district if they vote left or if they vote right or they vote in the middle. Most of the American public happen to be in the middle, not in the left or not in the right.
Just to underline Jocelyn's point, this is not a pipe dream. I think there are, 5 or 6 states now that have taken the redistricting process out of the hands of the legislature and put it in the hands of some kind of citizens group or at least nonpartisan body. So
but she's right. We should have a bipartisan redistricting commission. I believe that it's the correct way to go. Congressional districts should be, lines should be drawn on the basis of common community interest, which is the way they used to be drawn. One man, one vote hurts it a little bit, drawing the lines, but common community interest should be the guide that you follow instead of, oh Lord, look, if you look at Southeast Michigan and the districts in Southeast Michigan as drawn for the next 10 years, that's a whiskey tango foxtrot.
yes, sir. Is there a? I'm sorry. Is the microphone already in the hands of somebody who wants to ask a question? And I'll get you next. I promise.
I don't know if, yeah, okay. Really, one comment, or 2 comments. First of all, the comment about people not voting in this country, and I spent a lot of time in international, and we probably have, amongst the democracies of the world, the worst record, or amongst the worst records in terms of voter participation. But as I always say in debates, when I ask somebody, the first question I ask them is, did you vote in the last election? If the answer is no, I basically tell them at that point, shut up, you voted for the winner. Have no basis to criticize because you ceded to exercise your civic responsibility and right. But I happen to live in the state of Maine, and there hasn't been too much commentary about this in terms of the activities of the super PACs and everything else that's going on. In that, what's interesting in Maine, and I understand the bridge thing here quite well, but we have an independent candidate for a senatorial seat, we have a Republican, and we have a Democrat. We also have 3 other independents, but that's typical for Maine, but they'll end up at 1% total, that bunch. But in any event, what has happened? The independent is incredibly popular to replace Olympia Snow, and the Democrat is pretty much of a novice, and the Republican is a standard politician, basically. And what's happening is that the super PACs, primarily the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and some unknown Republican-funded group, I say unknown in that they don't know who's behind it, are pouring money into the Democrats' campaign. So they're turning the Democratic candidate into a straw candidate to enhance theirs. So, and that's outright manipulation. And if your electorate isn't paying attention, they can be conned by that activity very, very easily. They won't be in the state of Maine because of the way politics are played there, and outside money is definitely something you don't want if you expect to be elected from that state. But the fact is that there hasn't been any discussion on it. But the fact is a lot of this money is anonymously donated, but is being handled in an incredibly negative fashion and not in the least bit interested in informing anybody about anything that has anything to do with any remote degree of accuracy.
When I was in college, I had a poster up on my wall that was Murphy's Law, and it said that the race does not go to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, but it's certainly the way to bet. So, as more people vote on American Idol than vote in presidential elections, or any election for that matter. And when you hear people talk about, political consultants talk about why they run negative ads when people say they don't like negative ads, they always say, because they work. As people become supposedly more disgruntled about our political system and think that they are immune and will turn off negative advertising, we continue to spend more and more money on it. What will need to change in people's character? I mean, anytime you build a dam, the water finds its way around it. Anytime you pass legislation to change campaign finance, people always find a way around it. So what needs to change in people, or what do you think is the best hope in the individual voter that will lead us so that classical conditioning does not win out and people think for themselves and are just not influenced by the number of political ads? I mean, when they're talking about the election this year and they follow the horse race, even though journalists say they don't want to follow the horse race, the thing that they report every week is how much money people raised. And that really knocks out a lot of the conversation about what the issues really are or where candidates stand. It's always who raised the most money this week or this month, as if just raising the money is what gets you to the finish line. What is it about human character that can change to lead us to a better future than the path that we're going down? What is your hope?
Well, I think that speaks to something that we haven't talked about tonight, which is citizen-funded campaigns, also known as public financing. I didn't know if the gentleman from Maine was going to bring that up or not in his remarks, but because Maine and other states in the New England area are examples of that. But there, and that's a whole other discussion, I think. But that said, it is one of response to your concern. If citizens are also investing through public funds in the campaigns, they have more at stake, and through that engagement is built. And that is oftentimes the argument made in response to the concern that more disclosure might just breed more cynicism, and that voters seeing all of the names attached to the money that's going into the campaigns and to the independent expenditures may lead voters to feel even more disengaged, whereas public financing citizen-funded campaigns may lead to that engagement. I just put that out there as that's the other argument in this debate that I think responds to some of your concerns.
From the free
I always think the truth equals victory, and who has the best policy. If you look at the campaign in 2008, we had public sources of money. One candidate took it, one candidate
Can't hear you.
didn't. If we look in the 2008 campaign, one candidate took the government money and one didn't. So in this campaign, both didn't. The one that didn't lost, the one that did, the one that took government money lost, the one that didn't won. Now, whether they won because of money or politics makes no difference. The fact is, I don't think government money is the right thing, because if you say you're going to get government money and you're going to exclude everything else, you restrict freedom of speech. And I don't know what the answer is other than that.
So is it always?
I don't think it comes down to money. It comes down to who has the best campaign and who has the truth, the best program. And that's the way we hope it works out.
Money certainly helps to define the message and define the conversation and define the issue environment, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee victory.
I agree with that.
I'm an assistant professor here in the School of Social Work, and everything that I think about how does it affect vulnerable populations. And so initially I was, in agreement with the arguments for full disclosure, but then my mind flashed back to the 2008 elections, the nooses that were in Virginia with regard to the Affordable Health Care Act and those debates and the death threats that happened there. And then I thought about, if we have full disclosure, how is that going to affect vulnerable populations, and how do we address
that? The question, I think, was, does full disclosure impose a heavier burden on vulnerable populations? I'm sorry.
I hear what you're saying, but I think it's the point I tried to make when I made my first comment. If we don't start to hold people accountable and we don't start to demand civility, we'll never get beyond that. And it's not just a vulnerable population. I am very opinionated, and I'm not afraid to say what I think, and I'm not afraid to stand up for what I believe in. And that's not always very popular in the city of Detroit and the county of Wayne. And I have a letter right now in my handbag that's an anonymous letter, that's a hate letter, because I stood up for something, and it happened to be a vulnerable person in what you would classify as a vulnerable population. And so a lot of people need to be protected. And my whole issue is, until we can stop people from blogging with fake names, and until we allow it to be accountable to do what we're doing without civility, we'll never get to where you want to be. And continuing to allow people to contribute to things without having their names behind it because we think we're protecting them, all we do is we create a scenario where people can continue to hate and people can continue to scare. And you don't protect anyone when you do that. And the people that want to help and drive change, just because they have more money or they have more resources, they're not protected either. Hate goes across the board. So what you have to do is you have to drive change across the board. And you start by forcing accountability, and you force accountability by forcing people to have to say what they believe in, what they give to, and what they do or do not support. And if they aren't willing to do that, and they aren't willing to have ownership, then they don't participate.
I can't end on any better note than that. So I want to thank all of you for coming. Mark, would you?
I want to thank Brian and the panel for a fantastic discussion. A discussion that was extraordinarily illuminating, passionately felt, and in some ways really quite remarkable because we found some significant agreement in a politically very diverse group at the front. And I also want to take the blame for the title, since I made it up. But I want to thank you all for coming, especially a big round of applause for Brian and the panelists. I invite you back next week for an equally interesting discussion of perhaps a much more controversial issue, same-sex marriage, September 27th in Community Arts Auditorium. Thank you very much.
I will, don't worry.
See you.
Good to see you.